My name is John Passfield, and the title of this reading will be the Poetic Novel Part 2, Video 15, Kingsley Amos, A-M-I-S. So here is the book, the Poetic Novel 2, Influences and Elements by John Passfield. So a title, a subtitle, 3 roses, and my name. Now, this copy is a manuscript, but there's a copy on my website, johnpassfield.ca, which is available to read for free. All you do is click on the cover icon of the book, and it'll be yours to read. The subtitle is Influences and Elements, as the essays in the book are about the writers who have influenced me and the elements that I've developed in my pursuit of a form for the poetic novel for our time. Now, the 3 roses are interesting. Gertrude Stein said a rose is a rose is a rose, but it's interesting that Gertrude Stein spoke about imagery in imagery. That's an image. You have to interpret it. She's not telling you what that means. Hemingway said that the dignity of an iceberg is that 7/8 of it are underwater. Well, what's that mean in terms of writing? So some writers speak about writing in imagery, and you have to interpret it. Others are a little more straightforward. So anyway, if you think about that, there's a lot there. The quotations in this essay are taken from the book Kingsley Amos, a biography by Eric Jacobs. I will read 3 of 9 segments of my essay, and then I will read a note which I wrote as I reviewed the essay for presentation. Okay, so here is a quote from that biography by Eric Jacobs. Talk of artistic aims or any other literary abstractions made him uneasy. For one thing, it tends to phoniness and posturing, which he absolutely detests in any form, whether in art or in life. For another, he already knows perfectly well what his artistic aim is. It is what it always has been, to write a good story about recognizable human beings in readable, which most definitely does not mean experimental, prose, the upshot of which will be the novel that he himself would enjoy reading. So that's the quotation from Eric Jacobs. Here's my response to that quotation. There are many topics that I could deal with as a response to this quotation, but I'll just mention a few things and leave some of the other topics for later quotations. It reminds me of the T.S. Eliot comment, which I read in my 20s, that Shakespeare and his contemporaries were fortunate to have inherited a form into which they could pour their own thoughts without the need to search for a form, which was exactly what Eliot felt he was forced to do, both in his poetry and in his poetic drama. Eliot and Pound told the writers and the readers of their generation that it was time to search for new forms. Now, I assume that most of the writers, readers, and commentators of that generation would have been glad to go on with the forms that they'd inherited, had people like Eliot and Pound not undermined their confidence in the inherited forms. Subsequently, writers broke into 2 camps. So, number 1, those who felt that there was nothing wrong with the inherited forms. It's the prose novel that I'm thinking of here, as written by Kingsley Amos. And number 2, those who felt that, yes, there was a need for new forms. Now, no doubt those who wished to be trendy, but who didn't really understand the concept of a form being suitable for its own time and not being suitable for a later time, latched onto the superficialities of the new poetry and the new drama and the new novel, and looked down on the superficialities of the old poetry and the old drama and the old novel. So I can see why those who, such as Kingsley Amos, wanted to carry on with the old forms, thought of those who wanted new forms as snobs who were prone to phoniness and posturing. The point that I would make, though, is that there was nothing wrong with the novel which told a good story about recognizable human beings, and which was quite readable on the surface, the novel which didn't need more than one reading to yield its value, but that there was also nothing wrong with the desire to find a form which would allow for deeper suggested meaning than was possible in the prose novel. The war, if there was one, between the 2 camps was entirely unnecessary. So either thought Both sides thought the other was wrong to write as they did. I'm saying neither was wrong at all. Okay, here's another quote from that book. He believes the writer must satisfy his customers and go to the wall, just like the widget maker. Here's my response to that quotation. I don't know whether anyone has ever done percentages on the writers whose work has lasted, who, number one, made their living from writing, and number two, those who did not make their living from writing. The first category of writer would then be broken down into, number one, those who made their living from the creative work they were doing, and number two, those who made their living from writing what was not their creative work, but which was lucrative enough to provide at least a living, if not a fortune. Very few people are fortunate enough to be born into circumstances wherein it isn't necessary for them to do work in order to be able to make a decent living, work which allows them to pay the bills for the basics, with the odd luxury thrown in. So, of course, most writers have had to earn a living while writing what they consider to be their most important work. I think that one of the struggles that creative writers have had is with the fact that most of the people who are not writers, but who are involved in what I would call the book trade, are those who feel that the primary purpose of the book trade is to make money. Creative writers often rely on publishers who either can't afford to carry creative writers whose books do not make money, or do not wish to carry creative writers whose books do not make money. This can often lead to a conflict in the mind of the creative writer himself or herself. When one looks at the biography of Dickens, or one looks at the biography of Thomas Wolfe, one realizes that there was often a point at which the planning of a creative work of fiction seemed to offer two conflicting reasons for writing that novel. Dickens altered his planning for the structure of a novel when sales were not as high as he wished them to be, and Thomas Wolfe yielded reluctantly to the wishes of his editor, Maxwell Perkins, for a change in the plans for the kind of novel that Wolfe wished to write. Presumably, though, we can say that the aim of Kingsley Amis to write novels which would please enough readers that it would lead to sales figures that would please both himself and his publisher led to novels which were pleasing to all three, the writer, the reader, and the publisher. Okay, here's the third quote from that book. A writer, Amos thought, could benefit greatly from having a private audience of one particular reader or a small group of them, and he believed that this had been characteristic of some of the better Victorian poets. The reader or readers would also be the first to see and respond to the writer's work, and it would be after their scrutiny that the work would be passed on to a larger audience. Okay, that's the quote, and here's my response to it. The concept of showing one's work to another writer or group of writers is a very common one. When I retired at age 53, after having taught literature for 32 years, I started to take night courses at the local university, which were billed as writing courses for prospective writers. Each week we'd be given an assignment and would hand that assignment in the next week, and a week later we would receive the piece of writing back with comments from the teacher. Student writers in these classes would often form smaller groups who would meet after the course was over with the purpose of exchanging writing and critiquing them. I joined a couple of these groups, and I found that after a fellow writer had read a short story of mine for a week, what would be written on it would be the words, "nice image," about halfway through the story, and "nice story" at the end of the story. I, on the other hand, made it my mission to write something about every section of the story, which would be every paragraph of prose or every half page of dialogue. No matter what was on the page, I found something to say about it. I remember handing a 9-page point form note to a writer whose chapter was only 6 pages long. So I wrote 9 pages of notes on a 6-page chapter. I did this not because I was such a benevolent person, but because even after 32 years of teaching some of the best literature ever written, I was teaching myself to be a writer. I was working out my own principles for the writing of the short story and later for the writing of the novel. At first, I thought these fellow writers were lazy. They were letting other things in their lives take precedence over their plans to be professional writers. But gradually, I came to the conclusion that they didn't have anything that they could say about a piece of writing. All of them were writing stories and wondering whether they were any good. The classic example would be the writer who asked everybody to read a chapter of her novel and tell her what was good and worth keeping and what was not good and which therefore should be changed. So, for these people, the exchange and comment system seemed to be a very workable system. But to me, it was not a workable system. What I concluded was that they were all trying to write the same kind of short story or novel, whereas I was not trying to write the same kind of novel. I was trying to figure out the form and the style of the John Passfield Poetic novel, and they were all trying to figure out the form and style of the generic novel which would produce success in the genre which each had chosen. They all accepted the idea that if they were going to please a publisher who would base his or her decision to publish or not publish on the assumption that this piece of writing was going to please the reader, then there was plenty that they could learn from the writing teachers and the fellow writers. My conclusion was that I had almost nothing to learn from fellow writers, as the comments that they made on my writing were designed to make it more like all the other writing and less like a John Passfield piece of writing. I have no doubt that the exchange and comment system worked well for Kingsley Amis, whose chief commentator was Philip Larkin, and vice versa. Okay, the 4th passage I'm quoting here from the biography of Kingsley Amis. By becoming a publicly known figure, Amis acquired an identity and an image which were easily confused with his work and blurred the intended distance between himself and his novels. Okay, that's the quotation. Here's my comment on it. I have no doubt that becoming a publicly known figure leads to the desired result of selling more of a writer's books. I assume that most people buy what I would call a commercial novel because they know almost everything about the form in which it is written and only look for a new surface to give them the enjoyment that they received when they first fell in love with the genre. Recently, I read some criticism about Charles Dickens, who died in 1870, but whose writings could be said to still be suffering from a critical confusion between the kinds of books he was most popular for writing while he was alive and the kinds of books he actually did write. I would say, as I've said about L.M. Montgomery, that even though each was able to create stories which had a popular appeal, each used those stories to write very seriously about the issues which concerned them most. In both cases, their popularity has continued beyond death, and the critics, some of them are presumably unconsciously prone to snobbery, phoniness, and posturing, while others are distracted by reputation. The critics don't always dig beneath the surface in order to ascertain the true value of the writings as serious literature. Okay, I'll stop reading there. The rest of the essay is available to read for free on my website, johnpassfield.ca. Now I will read a note which I wrote while reading this essay over for presentation. So here's the new note. I mentioned in my introduction to this essay that it might seem to some to be very odd for me to be writing about a writer whose fiction I've never read. I've never read a Kingsley Amis novel. However, I don't find it odd at all. In fact, I've often said that I didn't realize in my earliest years as a reader and even as a teacher of literature that my concern when reading fiction and when reading criticism of fiction is not to understand the ideas of either writer, but to understand my own ideas with more clarity and more precision. It strikes me as well that the writers of the most serious literature know the least about their works. Number one, I would say that the category of writers who know the most about the fiction that they write are the writers of the prose novels, who either present themselves as a narrator or who create a fictional narrator whose role is to guide the reader to an understanding of the meaning of that piece of fiction. That's why these writers write in prose and tell the story in the third person, in the past tense, as an event which has happened and which, when thought about, can be quite well understood. Number two, I would also say that the category of writers who know the least about the fiction that they write are the writers of poetic novels, the best of which have no narrator, as they are novels which contain no voice, whose role is to guide the reader to an understanding of the meaning of that particular work of literary art. What the writer of the poetic novel is doing is presenting what he or she has decided is significant information, which by its placement side by side with other significant information becomes an image pattern which all three, author, main character, and reader, can interpret in the illuminating light of their own life experiences, from which they select significant information which they arrange in their own minds in image patterns of significance. Whatever the meaning of the piece of poetic fiction is to the author, to the main character, or to the reader, it can never be the same meaning, as their life experiences have led them to interpret not only fiction, but life itself quite differently. So, this is an explanation not only of why I prefer to read poetic fiction, but why I prefer to write poetic fiction. To me, prose fiction is entertainment, a turning aside from the living of life to the reading of a novel which acts as an explanatory essay, before returning to the reading of fiction, which insists on presenting all of the complexity and all of the challenges which we humans find in our actual lives. Okay, so once again then, this is my book, The Poetic Novel 2, Influences and Elements by John Pasfield. It's not a physical book, so it's not found on Amazon. It's not found on my publisher's website. It is found on my website at johnpasfield.ca. There are 15 essays on all on different topics, but on all aspects of novel writing, fiction, the novel, the prose novel, the poetic novel, and so on. So if you're interested in that kind of topic, have a look at johnpasfield.ca. Lastly, I'll just say thank you for watching this video.